So, I think without further ado, let's start with the first question. Santiago is immediately leaping in. You can always introduce yourself if you want to. Anybody who asks a question, but please do so if you'd like to.
Santiago Levy from Mexico. So this is sort of a question for Ben or for Juan, I'm not really sure. But the double taxation issue is sort of interesting, right? So I think Ben sort of implied, but I'm not sure, that if the gangs make rents from drugs, they don't have to tax the local population. So there's no double taxation in the sense that state taxes, they substitute the service provision through the gangs. But a little bit reading from Juan is, in fact, in the areas where the drugs are being produced, there is double taxation because the gangs are impeding the state to function and different. So can you elaborate a little bit more on sort of the double taxation dimension? If you allow the gangs to substitute the state and they collect taxes and the state doesn't collect taxes, maybe that's not Shabbat equilibrium, as opposed to if you're being doubly taxed and you're only receiving sort of one set of services for double taxation.
Great, thank you very much.
Should we take a round of questions? It seems like there's more questions than there are.
I'd like to take a round.
If that's okay with everybody.
So
We'll make sure
we have
everybody
a question here. If you can put the microphone over. Great, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Great panel. Congratulations on your presentations. My name is Francisca. I'm based in Berlin at ISDC, and I have a question for Ben. I was wondering if you were able to assess how much of your results are explained by trust in the police, especially considering the Brazilian case where there's a lot of corruption or perception of corruption. And the comparison with other countries came into my mind, like, I don't know, for example, Chile, where people had a lot of more trust in the police in this case. So basically, if you as a citizen are forced or are kind of like obliged to, I don't know, give money or give bribes, maybe people just prefer to keep those into their communities, into their own gangs, instead of just like giving them to the state. So maybe, I don't know if that's something that you explore or not. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. So let's take a third and then maybe we'll come back. Yeah, so I can see a hand over there.
Thank you. These were great presentations, but apologies, this is again a question for Ben. I was just curious to know if you have a sense of how the state perceives or is aware of this complementarity between the rebel-provided and the state-provided services, and what is their attitude towards them? Do they, at the local level, do they see these complementarities as something to benefit from, or is it really sort of seen as competition and maybe do the perceptions vary at the local and higher levels? Thanks.
Good, thank you. So that's 3 questions, Ben and Juan. And also, team, you can ask questions among yourselves. And so let's respond to those first 3, please. Thank you.
Great, thanks for those questions. They're all great. So on the double taxation thing, there's a couple levels of it. First of all, and I didn't present it today, but in my as kind of a companion to this book, I have a formal model of sort of duopoly of violence or gang state governance that just deals explicitly with this. So some gangs do tax. If you think about El Salvador, the Maras, they didn't have a drug market, and so they were taxing people. There's a lot of extortion in Medellin as well. But gangs, when they have access to these drug rents, as you accurately summed up, they don't need to rely on taxation, right? And so part of my whole argument is in those situations, you really do get a kind of I don't want to say optimal outcome, but it's almost a dangerously optimal outcome where the state is enjoying the benefits of governance. It's not paying any fiscal costs. The governance is being paid for out of illicit drug profits. And it's quite often a lot of governance, right? So it's quite often quite orderly in those places. And so it's a sort of a trap in a sense. And I think it does dialogue with Juan's work in really interesting ways. And I will let him comment on that if he'd like. I think the one difference is, I believe you're looking at places where drugs are being produced, right? And so it's a little bit different than this drug retailing dynamic. And so that's what I would say about that. So let me just answer the other two questions, and then maybe Juan wants to jump in. Also, Francisca, great question. So I think you're talking about those correlation results, right? Those were across Latin America, and it's quite surprising to us that it's not surprising to us that in places where people say there are criminal gangs, they think the police are more corrupt. That's very straightforward. It is surprising that in the subset of places where the gangs are providing order, people think the police are less corrupt, right? That was a surprising result. I don't have a total answer for that, and at that kind of cross-regional correlational why that is, other than to say that I think it is evidence for something that I've come to believe, which is that criminal governance isn't fundamentally about bribery and corruption. No gangs are not bribing police to allow them to govern civilians, right? They're governing civilians to kind of push the state out, to keep people from calling the police, to give police less of a reason to come in. They're not, so when they govern more, it's possible that police are just sort of just not around as much, right? And that may be what's driving this, that there's just, you don't see the cops coming in getting bribes from drug traffickers anymore because they're just no longer need to come into the neighborhood whatsoever, or something like that. I will say that the impetus for criminal governance in Brazil with the factions that I showed you, and I think in a lot of other places, where these groups got going in the first place was often in response to, and their ability to establish governance over favela slum populations has to do with a history of violent, unaccountable, racist, discriminatory policing, which makes civilians sometimes more sort of disposed to criminal groups coming in and actually protecting them from the state. So some of the way that criminal groups get a foothold in terms of governance is because of very bad policing or bad, when I say bad, I mean indiscriminate, violent, racist, and so on and corrupt. And the last question, this is also a super fascinating question. You know, I address it in my book in kind of sort of lots of different ways. I think you can think of the state at different levels. I think that at the lowest level of prison guards, police officers, people who are face-to-face with criminal groups, they definitely understand the complementarity, and they're like, yeah, sure, you govern these prison cells. I'll stand outside of the prison and let you guys do the governing on the inside. They're absolutely aware of it. That's why the gangs govern in the first place, because they get state prison guards and police to kind of back off, right? Police officers who were originally, assigned to do beats in favelas, once they see that the gangs are kind of taking care of day-to-day stuff, they absolutely back off. And that's part of the logic in the first place. At the middle level of administrators and stuff, I think there's a kind of, I call it modi vivendi, right? Modus vivendi. They kind of come to learn that, okay, I can send in the health workers and they're not going to get shot up. It's at arm's length. So it's not corrupt. But they sort of learn to do their thing. And governors, elected officials quite frequently will sort of focus on other things, lowering crime rates or violent homicide rates or other things that are kind of more prominent than say, I'm going to tackle this issue that gangs are ruling and doing dispute resolution. I'm going to replace them from these communities. And then I think I take a sort of a broad macro level view. How is this possibly sustainable over 30 or 40 years, right? We're not just talking about a single administration or a single government. We're talking about whole, long periods of time. That I do think is there's I don't want to say an awareness of the complementarity, but I think that there must be complementarity. If it was fiscally terrible for states like Brazil or Colombia or to sustain this duopoly of violence, if there were double taxation that was consistently wasteful and inefficient, I think after 40 years, somebody would have figured out a way to deal with it.
Okay, thanks, Ben. I should just say, if we want to bring up any of the slides again, we can now do that on any of the more technical points. So Juan, I think there was some.
Yeah,
you were going to intervene here.
Thank you, Santiago, for the question. I think this is this particular setting is not one that is very prone to double taxation. I think the benefit of the illegal groups in this setting is just sort of the management of the production and transformation, and then down the road trafficking of the illegal drug. They are not taxing the peasants, but rather paying the peasants for the product and then transfer the product. I think the double taxation, which is present in most of Colombia, is a more urban phenomenon for businesses of all sorts that they're trying to make profits by selling goods. So I think here the problem in the context that we're saying in this paper is not one that is particularly one of double taxation.
Great, yeah. So thanks, Sebastian. So I think that answers the questions on that first round. So let's take a second round. So who's up next? Please, gentleman at the back. Sorry, my apologies. It's because of lighting.
Good afternoon. I'm from the Philippines, and I come here to this session picking up from yesterday afternoon's last session that talked about informal groups providing social protection. So I come to this session thinking non-state actors, we're talking here of religious groups, kins and associations, and in fact, it's extraordinary institutions like rebel groups, armed groups, gangs, etc., which is also true in some cases in the context of my country. But my question to all of you now is, what are you now saying in terms of moving forward and promoting social protection? Are these institutions to be legitimized? Are they to be engaged? Are they to be considered part of the context that we now have to acknowledge? And how do we navigate this context now? If you're saying that they are in fact playing legitimate roles in the community and providing informal social protection in a way.
Okay, thank you very much. That's a fundamental question. So is there another question? Is a follow-up to that? If not, please, yeah, again. The microphone, please, yeah.
So an implication is if you eliminate drug rents, you will have in urban areas double taxation, because these gangs are not going to have the other sources of income. So in a way, it's kind of a catch-22, because if you put down drug trafficking for other reasons, you're going to take away a source of rents, and they're going to substitute from other sorts of rents like extortion, local tax on businesses and whatnot.
Yeah, thank you. So let's have the panel respond to those two, please. Anybody? Go ahead. I mean, Laura, do you want to take the question on the broader question?
Jesus. Okay, I have to say I don't work on social protection, but I think it's an important question. So what I think about often is more like the engagement of rebel groups during conflict for service provision, or thinking about some of the design of these interventions. And I think it's relevant, and it does depend, like some rebel groups govern without necessarily as high levels of legitimacy as you might think of, but so do states. And for some of the multilateral development banks, it's states who are their primary counterpart, so to say. But in some settings, this is not necessarily maybe the most valuable approach. But to be honest, I'm maybe not the person to necessarily tell you exactly what kind of makes sense on average, because it's probably quite context specific. If you think about, like, for instance, all these presentations now together, each of these armed groups has like governed and like handled populations quite differently. And that often differs from place to place. And so it probably matters a lot kind of like what kind of like context you're looking at. And what sort of levels of legitimacy these groups hold. But some of these governance services or structures that they engage in are quite relevant, and once these groups might cease to exist or are engaged in negotiations or whatever, there is probably some value in thinking about continuity in some of these institutions, because institutions, as I kind of like proposed, bring some sort of continuity that can be very important for civilians to know how to behave and how to engage. And maybe then we can still take a second step to think about sort of this like social contract and so on. But I don't know. I'll give the floor to Ben. He's the most senior one.
Or anybody, I mean, Sebastian, please, you can come in as well, but whichever the team wants to take up some of these big questions. And don't forget Santiago's one as well. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for your answer. I also think that it's a very relevant question. Sorry. Yeah, I think that one key actor that probably we are not considering too much in these presentations is the role of communities and how civilians, they are not neutral in front of the armed groups' control or governance. And they also participate in the informal provision of public goods. There are some kind of alliance or acceptance of the rebel governance or criminal governance, and they in some way contribute to the provision of this informal this informal social protection. So to moving forward, I think that the states first, of course, the rivalry with armed groups should be, I don't know if terminated, but should be reduced. But also the states can recognize that communities are an important actor, and they can, this informal provision of public goods can continue with the support of the state, without the sponsor of rebel groups and criminal groups. But I think that if the states required to consider that civilians, communities can also are an important actor in such provision. Yeah.
Okay, Juan, you want to chip in?
Yeah, but to Santiago, I think your prediction, Santiago, is spot on. I would probably separate this logic from the idea of double taxation, but I think that in terms of extortion, right, which is going to be double taxation to the extent that the government actually does its job and taxes, which is not necessarily the case everywhere in the developing world, especially in many parts of Latin America. But in terms of extortion, I think your prediction is spot on. So to extend that, and you see that that's already happening in Latin America, right? So in T-1, there were big cartels that had sort of the monopoly of the entire sort of drug production and trafficking chain, and most of the profits were in their hands. There were less extortion than now that there's atomization of groups. So with very little rents relative to the rents that the people that place the drug in the local markets in the US and Europe obtain, and therefore they have to diversify in other dimensions, including extortion. I think that therefore the extortion as a problem in urban areas in Latin America is increasing potentially for that reason, which means that double taxation may have been increasing in areas in which the state is actually taxing.
Okay, thank you. Well, I don't know, did that satisfy you? Yep, you seem satisfied. I mean, you can always chat over lunch.
Can I just jump in?
Please,
I'll be very brief because
Yeah,
I know
no,
some
jump
people may
in.
have more questions, but a couple of points. So I agree with what's been said so far, particularly Juan's comments about, if you were to legalize all drugs, which isn't going to happen, but let's just say you legalized all drugs, and you did so in a way that the groups that currently are engaged in retail, right, who operate out of urban peripheries, let's say you make drugs legal and they can be sold in normal pharmacies so that the retail drug trade in urban peripheries disappears, right? And so your instinct, they would move into extortion. Quite probably, right? Or places like Medellin where groups kind of do a little bit of both, right? And the ones where there's more drug profits extort a little less. They would substitute back into extortion. Yes, probably. One thing I want to emphasize, and again, this is kind of coming out of my theoretical work, but I think there's strong theoretical reasons to believe that groups that live off of extortion, taxation, if you will, govern less than groups that are engaged in the retail drug trade. And why do I think that? Because the incentives to provide public goods, to provide good governance locally when you're doing extortion, basically flow from the idea, sort of the classic stationary bandit idea. If I govern my people better so that they have more economic growth, there'll be more for me to tax. Now that's a real incentive. I mean, that is why states provide governance and stuff, but it's not as strong of an incentive as I've got this super lucrative retail drug trade going on right here. I'm open air drug market and I don't want anyone calling the cops on me. That's a very powerful incentive and there's a lot of resources involved. So my strong instinct is that not only will there be double taxation, but there will be way worse and lower quality and less intense governance provided by gangs. And I think you can just look to El Salvador under the Matas as an example. Those gangs did not govern their populations particularly well. They were very violent. They were extremely extortionate. And you can see part of Bukele's popularity is that he liberated those, or liberated, maybe not the right word, but he has replaced what was a very violent and sort of extortionate kind of criminal governance. Whereas in places where there's a lucrative drug trade and the gangs are able to govern very effectively, as in Sao Paulo, people seem pretty satisfied with criminal governance, right? They're actually getting pretty good service provision, and they're not paying taxes for it. So I think that's another thing to bear in mind.
Thank you, Ben. Yeah, please. Yeah. Yeah, please jump in.
I completely agree with that. So, because if you think what's the only service that groups that engage in extortion provide, it's protection, and it's protection against themselves, right? So, and that's it.
Yeah, I mean, that's quite a fundamental point, I think. So, another round of questions. Is anybody wanting to leap in, particularly on Laura's very fascinating discussion? Please, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Miri from Aalto University here in Helsinki. Thank you for the presentations. I was already before this point over here about the policy implications of this. I had maybe a related point, so let me try to phrase that. So, I mean, some of the presentations were more about this, like gangs and illegal drug-related activity. Laura's was, I think, in a sense, very different, because it's also a non-state actor, but it's kind of like at least at the kind of higher levels, kind of ideologically motivated actor that tries to sort of change the whole system and take over. So I was just interested in hearing maybe your thoughts about what are the parallels and where does it differ, both in terms of, I mean, you were talking about kind of how the communities react. Maybe that's more similar, but yeah, still some discussion about the parallels and the differences in terms of this, like sustainability, for example, and yeah, in those situations.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, that's a really fascinating question because of motivations and how we think about motivations, and as economists and sort of some rational political scientists, we think more about economic motives and ideologies and other norms. Before we take the response to that, I have a question at the back, and then the gentleman is going to take a second one. So please.
Mirzo from University of Helsinki. I had a feeling, correct me if I'm wrong, in your cases from Brazil, Iraq, elsewhere, in a way there was not much difference in the areas which are governed by kind of illegitimate kind of rulers and those which are governed by the kind of state agents. So there is a popular belief that, for example, complex societies or complex production systems require a complex governance. And if that's true, like, does it mean that because there is not much difference in these two systems that you are like areas that you are considering, is because there's a low base that each kind of took off, and that's why there is not much, and the kind of societies or the kind of production or kind of systems, they do not require this kind of complex governance. That's why there is not much kind of difference in outcomes. And if it's true, like at what level, for example, Ben was considering Brazil, and I understand like in Brazil, like there's a very, very big difference in terms of economic growth, kind of development, etc. And from that, for example, can we take something think of some kind of level at what level, for example, these kind of governance outcomes will start to differ?
Okay, thank you for your question. And then we're going to take the third from over here, and then I'll allow responses back, and that probably will be taking us towards the end of the session, but we'll see. So please.
Thank you. I forgot to introduce myself earlier. I'm Yashodhan Ghurpade. I'm at the World Bank. Just reflecting on this last interaction we had on the possibility of double taxation. I'm not very familiar with the Latin American context, but in other rebel-held areas, which are often among the poorest areas, and I'm thinking a lot about the Maoist areas in India, there is actually quite a limit to how much you can tax the people. And I wonder if, just because of the prevailing poverty levels and so on, and I wonder if, striking at the sources of revenue could be part of a counterinsurgency strategy. In the first step, you sort of deprive them of resources and then move in with more military campaigns and so on, so it's more effective. So how does this sort of calculus play into that in your context? Is this something to also think about while thinking of taxation? Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So 3 questions, and perhaps Laura, do you want? You got a response on the very first of those, on the sort of motivations, ideologies versus rational choice?
I think some of the questions sort of tie a little bit together. I will leave a little bit of room for Ben to discuss the difference between criminal organization and political non-state actors, because he wrote a paper on it. So, but from kind of like my point of view, I think kind of like this ties a little bit also to Yashan's question, is that you often have like some sort of history of marginalization in some of these areas, right? And some sort of like weak or ineffective state structures, because otherwise, like, why would these groups necessarily be able to take space up in these areas? But for instance, like we also see Sweden increasingly seeing some criminal governance or like at least criminal activity in some areas. So it's not necessarily just strong states per se that can be thought of sort of as like a blank, either your high capacity or low capacity, but there's like spatial variation that can be from neighborhood to neighborhood. If you've ever lived in like any place really, maybe not Finland, but even I'm sure Finland, there can be like stark discrepancies if you move from neighborhood to neighborhood, and this kind of like speaks to what Yashan was talking about, is sort of this relationship with civilians matter. And this also matters when we think about building social contracts and thinking about like reducing activity of some of these groups, whether they're criminally motivated or politically motivated. And yes, their sources of taxation might matter, and it matters a lot depending on their context. Like, are they operating in a drug producing area versus are they operating as like a drug retailer? I mean, you should really watch. Oh, what is that? Anyways. But it really matters to think about sort of this relationship to civilians and thinking about this history of marginalization, what it actually means to build like a strong state, and that social protection and kind of poverty reduction needs to be thought of sort of in these settings as like an important avenue to sort of like think about ways to at least improve perceptions of the state. Because even though, like, for instance, like in this kind of like the correlational analysis, they showed sort of, okay, corruption of the police, if it's actually less corrupt, then civilians might actually engage in, or like there's more criminal governance. But still, even there, I'm pretty sure that's kind of like an effect that is quite conditional given this entire Latin American context, in which corruption, if you're stopped at the somewhere on the street and you have an accident, you're very unlikely to be like, hey, I'm going to call the police to ask for help, because you're like, hey, they're just going to charge me even more, and then I end up here with even more problems. And so kind of like this entire concept of social protection and poverty, sorry, now I'm losing like complete track, is kind of like, I think, really important to think about like solutions for some of these problems that we're seeing, whether it's like Iraq or Brazil.
Okay, thank you. So, are we going to leap in? Ben's going to leap in. And then I want to give then a couple of words to both Sebastian and Juan, and then we'll close the session. So Ben, please.
I'm going to try to say something about this sort of, political armed group versus criminal armed group, or what are we talking about here? I'm part of a group that's called the non-state armed governance kind of research network, and we're thinking about ways. Nobody wants to say that rebel governance and criminal governance are the same. On the contrary, we're trying to think about ways in which, where do they overlap and how are they distinct, and what's the defining characteristics, and really sort of how to grapple with this. And it is a perennial problem because the distinction between political armed groups and criminal armed groups isn't merely an analytic or academic one. It's a live wire political one. criminal groups are constantly trying to sell themselves as political groups because there will be potential for amnesties, right? Pablo Escobar tried to say he was an insurgent so that he could get an amnesty from the government. And vice versa, lots of people will often criminalize politically motivated groups and say, no, they're just narco-terrorists or whatever. Uribe tried to characterize the FARC as narco-terrorists and say they're beyond the pale. We don't negotiate with drug trafficking groups, right? So that border is not just some sort of analytic one. It's one that's contentious politically because there's something at stake. That doesn't mean that we can't analytically think about it. But even analytically, it's very slippery because, yeah, sure, political groups have ideology, right? But criminal groups have ideology. The groups I study, they have statutes, they have code books, they have a deep normativity to them where they stand for the fight against oppression, right? These are prison gangs who indeed have suffered torture at the hands of guards, who indeed have suffered human rights violations at the hands of the state, and they see themselves as organizing to push back against an oppressive state. So in that sense, they're not so different from a political or guerrilla movement in the countryside. How do I think about the difference? I think the critical difference that you can get a handle on is that the criminal groups really are not trying to do competitive state building. They're really not trying to secede from or topple the state and take over all of the functions of the state. In other ways, they may look a lot like criminal groups rebel groups, or rebel groups may look like criminal groups, but that seems to me a pretty key distinction. Of course, there's rebel groups you might say the same thing of, are the remnants of the FARC really still trying to topple the state? No, they're kind of just doing some kind of criminal thing. Okay, fine. Maybe in that sense, they are more on the scale towards criminal governance. This is how I think about approaching this problem. And I want to circle back to the prior question about, so what do we do, right? How do we move forward? And I think this is where criminal governance is extremely thorny and difficult issue. To the extent that you have sort of purely ideological political groups, it's hard to negotiate with them, as we know. It's hard to sit down at the negotiating table. It's hard to do post-conflict agreements. There's all kinds of roadblocks and obstacles, but it can be done, right? And it can happen. And groups can demobilize. They can become political parties. They can contest political power through formal channels. It is not at all clear what the road forward looks like with criminal groups. Precisely because they're criminal, the state can't negotiate with them or feels that it can't negotiate with them. Attempts to negotiate with criminal groups almost always flounder and fail because it is so politically, it's just unpopular. Nobody thinks it's okay to sit down with drug trafficking groups and negotiate or treat them as equals. It's just politically toxic in a way that, even however toxic it is to sit down with the FARC, it's 1,000 times more toxic to sit down with Pablo Escobar, right? For possibly good reasons. So that kind of negotiation or formalizing them, that's very difficult, right? Taking advantage, and I think this is a really key thing coming out of Laura's research, like taking advantage of the governance institutions that criminal groups have and have implemented and that have been actually contributed to the miracle of Medellin or contributed to the miracle of Sao Paulo, right? The transformation of huge urban areas from murder capitals into prosperous and sort of model cities, right? There's real human capital there. There's real knowledge about how to govern urban peripheries. The state would love to have some of that. But how to formalize that and make that part of formal state governance is not at all clear. First, because the groups themselves are demonized and seen as sort of beyond the pale in terms of negotiation. Second, because the groups are often made up of they come from the lower rungs of society, whereas rebel groups quite often have leaders who are college educated and things like that. These really are the poor and the outcast, and so they don't have political power. They're not okay as political interlocutors, especially in class-driven societies. And third, because some of their governance techniques, some of their ability to govern so effectively comes precisely from their illegality, comes precisely from the fact that they don't have to give due process, that they can use sometimes lethal force in I don't want to say arbitrary ways, but in ways that the state would be more constrained. So it's not just a question that the state could copy these techniques or something. There's a very real sense in which what has become established in these places is a system where the lower classes live in urban peripheries and are governed by groups who are not constrained by the rule of law and nonetheless govern very effectively, right? So how are you going to replace that with a system where people in those communities do enjoy full citizenship and do enjoy the democratic rule of law, and yet have some similar level of order at the local level is a huge, huge challenge. And I'm sorry I don't have an answer for that, but I think that's the challenge before us.
That's a very good response, I think, a good clarification. So a last word from Juan and Sebastian. Do you want a last word, Juan? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy to say something. Just to circle back to the very last question that we had, I think it's very similar what you described for the Maoist rebel in India and the contexts that we stand in Latin America. So I think that, again, the double taxation, I think, is more like an urban phenomenon, especially when, particularly for businesses, even micro and small scale businesses or medium scale businesses, but it's not for rural. It's a rural phenomenon. I think in that case is similar, and I completely agree. So I think that it's always a good idea to try to strangle the finances of organized criminal groups and rebel groups as well. I think it's very difficult, right? If you think about the cases that we study in terms of illegal drugs, I think it's difficult if you don't actually think bigger in terms of legalization and management of illegal drug consumption as a public health problem. So it's very difficult to do that. It's also very difficult to try to manage money laundering, and these are issues that we have been studying for Latin America in the last couple of months, and it's extremely difficult, but it's something, and it's also, you also have to take into account that, and Mexico is a good example of this, once you try to strangle illegal organizations economically in particular areas, they rapidly move to other areas, and they're very fast moving, but nonetheless, I think it's a good idea to try to attack them economically as much as you can.
Okay, thank you. And Sebastian, are we leaving Juan with the last point, or is there anything you'd like to add?
No.
No, you're okay. Great. Okay, so I'd like to thank. I'd like to thank our panelists for an excellent discussion, and give us a lot of food for thought over food. So, thank you.